Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Reentry Housing Strategies webinar. My name is Shaun Rogers, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of speakers that are taking part in this webinar. These speakers include Andy McMahon from the Corporation for Supportive Housing, hopefully Nadine Scamp and Mary Bushner, both from the Volunteers of America Texas organization, and they're both having trouble getting signed on to the webinar right now, so we hope that they're able to join us. And finally, Stephen Norman from the King County Housing Authority. I'd also like to thank Carol Wilkins for identifying the panelists for this webinar and for coordinating the development of the webinar. After the presentations by our speakers, there will be time for a question and answer session. To ask a question, please type the question into the Q&A panel located in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will do our best to answer your questions, but with nearly 700 attendees, it is unlikely that we will be able to get to all of your questions. If you encountered technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording this event and will post it on our website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We should have the webinar posted online later this week, and once it has been posted, we will email you a link to the recording. Before turning to our presenters, I'd like to highlight a couple of housing-related resources. The first is a podcast that was created by Carol Wilkins, the chair of the National Reentry Resource Center's Housing Committee. The podcast was created to complement this webinar, and if you haven't already watched the podcast, I would encourage you to do so after the webinar. The second resource that we'd like you to be aware of is the Reentry Housing Options, the Policymaker's Guide. This guide was released by the Council of State Governments Justice Center earlier this year, and provides practical steps that lawmakers and others can take to increase public safety through better access to affordable housing options. I'd now like to turn the webinar over to our presenters, the first of which is Andy McMahon of the Corporation for Supportive Housing.
Thank you very much, Shaun, and thank you for having me and CSH present as part of this webinar. My name is Andy McMahon, and I work with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Today I'd like to talk very briefly about supportive housing, then identify a handful of key strategies around accessing housing for people involved with the criminal justice system, and then briefly mention a couple of examples on the ground. To begin with, CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, is a national nonprofit organization that has been around since 1991. Our mission is to provide advocacy, expertise, leadership, and financial resources to develop and operate supportive housing, all with the goal of preventing and ending homelessness in America. As part of our efforts in 2005, we launched Returning Home, which is a targeted initiative focusing on integrating the resources between the criminal justice, behavioral health, and housing systems to create supportive housing and end the cycle of incarceration and homelessness that so many people in America face. Quite simply, the central premise of our work through Returning Home is that there is a significant cohort of people in communities all across the country who go through a very costly from a financial perspective and tragic from a human outcome perspective cycle of of homelessness and incarceration and utilization of other crisis public systems that we do all at great public expense with very little positive human outcomes. Our assertion is that placing these people into supportive housing will not only improve outcomes for the tenants, but also more effectively and efficiently utilize public resources. The slide, I apologize, I was not moving that slide. I'm going to talk very briefly about the kind of intersection of these systems and the people involved with them at this point. And I think the highlight here that I would mention is that the overlap and intersection among people who have histories and involvement in the jail system, the prison system, and the homelessness system is very significant. and that for a great number of these people also have chronic health conditions, including mental illness, substance use issues, and often or tri-occurring disorders. And for this population, I guess I want to say at the outset that supportive housing is focused on a small but significant cohort of people with long histories of criminal justice involvement, but also who have histories of homelessness and have significant chronic health conditions that challenge their reentry into the community and their ability to stay stably housed and off of the streets. At CSH, we promote the model and intervention of supportive housing, which a few key tenets that I want to mention here is that the housing is permanent. So it is not transitional in nature, and tenants are allowed to stay in their housing as long as they need to or would like to, and that they get all of the rights and responsibilities of having a lease or rental agreement arrangement, just as anyone living in any affordable rental community would have. Second key component is that the housing is affordable. Generally, the target is to have people pay no more than 30% and certainly no greater than 50% of their household income for rent. And then I think that the key point here around supportive housing, though, is that really it is housing that is integrated and linked to and tailored to the support services that people need. So whether that is mental health services, substance use services, employment services, et cetera, that those services are provided to people as a linkage to their housing. In terms of how the supportive housing looks, it is often, in many cases, kind of site-based or in a supportive housing building or project, if you will, but there is also an immense amount of supportive housing that happens in a scattered site, kind of apartment by apartment in the community approach. I'm now going to talk about, mention 4 key strategies from our perspective and our experience in accessing housing and supportive housing for people involved in the criminal justice system. And you can see I've mentioned 4 here. I'm going to largely pass over the accessing publicly funded housing because I know Steve and Norman will be covering that at length. But to talk briefly about these strategies, the first I want to mention is the need to have strategies so that we are providing actual linkages from incarceration into the community. One of the key challenges that we see is kind of the handoff, if you will, is when people walk out the prison door or walk out the jailhouse door, they have nowhere to go, no one to talk to, no one to turn to. And so several key components from our perspective in terms of creating those linkages are certainly working within the criminal justice system to develop detailed discharge plans that outline where people will be living. But importantly, I think the key point I want to make here is that in our experience, it's also extremely important to create linkages or do what we consider in-reach into the jail or prison among supportive housing and other housing providers so that we're doing some of that kind of tenant engagement and that relationship development while people are still in the prison and then doing employment or housing applications, benefits applications, and those sorts of things in advance so that when somebody walks out the jailhouse door or the prison house door, they have a connection into the community and somewhere to go. I think that is a really critical piece because as many people on the call and certainly on the panel I'm sure are aware, those first few hours or day once somebody is released from jail or prison is really critical to determining what will happen next. So I want to be clear that before we're even talking about the kind of housing strategy piece, that need for the linkage when somebody's exiting the institution and reentering the community not only needs to involve the discharge planning on the criminal justice side, but also the involvement of the housing community and the community mental health community and the substance use community to engage and identify folks prior to release so that we are creating at least more seamless handoffs back into the community. The 3 key strategies that I'm going to mention here for trying to access housing for this population involve private market, kind of private landlords, publicly funded housing, which Stephen will be talking about, and then briefly dedicated housing or supportive housing. First and foremost, certainly the greatest number of actual housing units in our communities are in the private market and are owned and managed by private landlords. And I think one of the key challenges that we've had, and I know many of you have had too, is trying to figure out how to engage with these landlords and figure out ways to convince them that they ought to rent apartments to the people that we are serving. The three strategies that I want to mention here, and the first, I guess, is an overall observation, and that is that when we think about how we engage private landlords, I think the single biggest thing we need to be able to do is to understand and mitigate the risk that they have. And some of that risk is real and some of it is perceived, and I think we need to be prepared to largely address both. And if you think about it, really what any private landlord, like any other landlord, is most interested in is the rent getting paid and the place, their apartment, not getting trashed, and there not being violence against people in the housing community. So those are at core the primary risk that landlords have, which I think we need to understand so that we can address those and mitigate those. Two or three things that we have found to be very effective along those lines. One is identifying and cultivating a network of housing providers up front, so that we actually go through and do pretty rigorous relationship building and outreach to landlords in the communities prior to wanting to place people with them, so that we're not just knocking on a door and saying, hey, we have this guy, he just got out of jail or prison, will you rent him an apartment? But we're actually identifying and cultivating and creating this network of providers that we can go to, that we have developed some relationship with, which I think is a really key component, is that cultivation of the relationship among landlords, and them also understanding that you as an organization and an entity in the community have a good reputation and will stand behind working with and housing the people that you are serving. So the two key things then that we utilize in terms of persuading and cajoling landlords, one is the linkage to support services, so that if a landlord, if somebody decompensates in the middle of the night, or the landlord has behavioral problems, or there's issues in the apartment or things of that nature, that the landlord feels like they have someone to turn to. And we have found that to be extremely beneficial, and that really opening up a lot of doors if they actually believe, and then the providers deliver on actually making it kind of a team approach and supporting that person while they're in the housing. We have seen to be a real way to mitigate some of the risk that people, some real and some perceived, around people acting out or decompensating or those sorts of things. The second piece, the financial piece, clearly every landlord wants and needs to get paid. And so a couple of approaches that we have used, one is master leasing approaches where a community-based organization is actually on the hook for the rent and master leases or rents many units in the community and then subleases those units to its tenants or clients, and thereby taking out the risk on the rent payment side for the private landlord. The second piece is really looking at rent loss reserve funds and creating funds where we have put in escrow resources to work with landlords and essentially say, if you'll provide 10 units of housing to this population, we'll put $10,000 in escrow, and if they bail on the place or don't pay their rent, we will cover your costs or cover damages. So again, it's a way to mitigate much of the risk that is seen by landlords. The second piece I just want to, I apologize. I went over. I apologize. The second strategy that I want to mention here is around dedicated housing and supportive housing. Along these lines, I would say there are three key strategies that we use in terms of creating and dedicating supportive housing for this population. One is creating set-asides within affordable housing or supportive housing developments. So in many cases working with housing developers and property owners of low-income housing tax credit projects or other supportive housing projects, and trying to get some set-aside of 5 or 10 units for this population within a 50 or 60 unit building, et cetera. And we have found that to be one way to assist in the reintegration and people who are willing to provide some assistance but don't want to dedicate an entire building or an entire project for people with long histories of homelessness and criminal justice involvement. That said, the second strategy is around creating single-site buildings that are dedicated. I would say that these have been successful in places where we have seen it and have worked on it. I would say this is, of the three, the least utilized for reasons related to NIMBY and a whole host of other issues. The third strategy, which I would say is fairly prevalent, is what I mentioned earlier around master leasing apartments and working and securing units in a scattered site manner where you may, operate in a neighborhood and within 15 buildings have, 50 units of 50 apartments that you own scattered throughout a neighborhood or a community. So those are, I think, the three core approaches that we have for accessing and creating dedicated housing and supportive housing. Now I'm going to talk very briefly about a few different examples. I think I've provided a handful of kind of overarching strategies, but want to be clear that in terms of some of the key elements and actually doing this, that we've in many communities across the country been able to operationalize this on the ground, if you will. The first example is in Hennepin County, Minnesota, where we did an analysis with Hennepin County that identified a little more than 250 people who had extremely long histories of incarceration and homelessness and use of detox and other facilities that was costing the county, quite honestly, quite a lot of money. In response, CSH developed a partnership with Hennepin County Community Corrections, the Housing Agency, and the State Department of Human Services, and partnered with St. Stephen's Human Services, a provider in the community who now provides in-reach services and does that tenant engagement and linkage to people while they're still in jail. And then immediately upon release, we are accessing both housing and service resources from the state, federal, and local level, combined with a little bit of philanthropic support to place these people immediately in the community and connect them to the support services that they need. You can see below the results have been very significant, with significant reductions in shelter nights, significant reductions in use of the county jail, significant reductions in arrest and other issues. So I think that the premise that I laid out at the beginning, we are seeing come to bear in evidence and in data in many places across the country. The second example I want to mention is in the state of Ohio, where we have a formal partnership with ODRC, the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, that is focused on placing now well upwards of 100 people into supportive housing upon their exit from the ODRC prison system. This initiative is focused on people with mental illness who are at extreme risk of homelessness upon release. And we have worked in partnership with ODRC, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of creating a network of providers in the community that are willing to both provide housing and support services to this population with targeted prison in-reach. So entities and supportive housing providers going into the prisons when people are coming up for release and doing that, again, that engagement and that initial relationship building. It's important to note that again, I mentioned earlier the need for interagency collaboration on these issues. This is another example where we have the lead and the leadership being provided largely by ODRC, but significant involvement and engagement from the mental health and housing delivery systems in the state of Ohio.
Andy, this is Shaun Rogers. Can I hop in just for a second? We've been having a little bit of technical difficulty getting Nadine pulled through, and I just wanted to make sure. Nadine, are you on the line? Hello, Nadine?
This is Mary Ann Nadine, yes.
Okay, Mary Ann Nadine, we've got you. Okay, good.
Okay.
Good. I just want to make sure that you're pulled through. Okay, go ahead, Andy. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. And the last example that I want to mention is in the city of New York, where we have a frequent users systems engagement or FUSE initiative ongoing that is a collaboration between the corrections and Rikers Island and homeless service providers and homeless service system, along with the mental health and housing systems and the Housing Authority in New York. Again, where we did a significant data analysis, identified more than 1,000 people with long histories of involvement in the criminal justice and homeless system, and again have created in-reach strategies where providers, their shuttles and their cars are allowed on to Rikers Island to do that engagement and to assist in the handoff as people are exiting Rikers Island, and then creating that network of supportive housing providers in the community who have the resources and expertise. I think we're working with 6 different providers in New York, I think 4 or 5 in Ohio, and just the 1 in Hennepin County here in Minneapolis. But where we have, again, created that network of providers so that we are able to immediately, upon release from the jail, in this case, or in Ohio in the case of prison, immediately place people as they reenter the community and connect them into safe, decent, affordable housing, along with the support services that they need. And I think the evidence that we have seen over the last 4 years or so, and the emerging evidence that will be coming forth in the next year or so, I think is very much proving the point and the hypothesis or premise that I laid out at the beginning, that if we can provide people who have long histories of homelessness and incarceration and have chronic health conditions, if we can provide them with the supports they need as they transition back into the community, link them up to the housing that they need, and then provide the tailored supportive services that they need, that we can actually increase their human outcomes and their benefit to themselves and the community, and reduce the cost to crisis public systems, including the homelessness system and the criminal justice system. I think that is it for me for now, Shaun. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Next is our next presenter is Mary Bushner from Volunteers of America, Texas.
Yes, and Nadine Scamp as well. And we are from Volunteers of America, which is a faith-based nonprofit organization that really works to address the root causes of poverty in America. And one of the major components that we've been doing in the Houston area is looking at women who have substance abuse issues and that subpopulation that is also dealing with incarceration. Look Up and Hope is a new initiative by Volunteers of America that is trying to take a holistic perspective to look at families that have a mother who is incarcerated. And what we're finding from the initial research is that the vast majority of those women also have a substance abuse problem and have multiple needs, not only for the woman, but for the caregivers, for other family members, and for the children. And if we're going to successfully place a woman into housing and have her keep that housing, all of these other services must be coordinated and they must be comprehensive. So the goals of the program is really to make sure that that family has the strength and stability that they need economically, emotionally, housing, employment, everything that they need to sustain self-sufficiency. I would encourage you to go to the national website, www.voa.org, and see the first research presentation. It's called Childhood Disrupted, and it looks at these families that are dealing with incarceration and some of the programming needs that are coming out of the research. Some of the programs that we do here in the Houston area really start at the beginning when mom is still incarcerated. We believe that it's very important to reach mother and family before they are released if you're going to develop the trust and rapport and services that they need to successfully have. So this program is the HUA, which is Women Helping Collaboration, Community Supervision, and Corrections. Harris County actually owns the correctional facility, and they provide the community supervision, so the security, the operations of the facility, and then Volunteers of America comes in and provides services. There are up to 130 women, and all of them have substance abuse-related offenses. They are normally there for 6 to 12 months, and while they're there, we work with them on their housing plans and on their life plans to make sure that when they leave, they have the tools needed to stay housed and employed and off of drugs. With this, we have one of the OJP Second Chance Mentoring grants, and we place the women with a strong community support person. So that's always a female, since we are dealing with women, and ideally someone that is in the same neighborhood or general geographic vicinity as that woman when she is released. The mentor provides that extra support so that if maybe they can't get in touch with a staff person or they don't feel comfortable talking with a staff person once they're released, they have somebody in the community that they know is there for them that they can go to with issues. So they can talk about, I'm having a little bit of trouble paying my rent this month, and they can work through some suggestions on that. The other program that we do that's pre-release is with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Services. And we have 25 women's residential beds for women exiting the state jail system. And they are provided comprehensive support services just like in HUA. So they are getting their residential substance abuse treatment, they are getting parenting skills, they are learning life skills, and working on all of the support services that are going to help them keep that housing when they get out. We have found that it is extremely important that you develop a very specific discharge plan with the women. Many of our women, because of their past histories of substance abuse and because of the underlying and multiple needs that they have, they are not very adept at doing future planning. Many of them have not thought about the future for so long that it's very difficult for them to develop those next steps. And so our case managers and counselors walk through the plan with the woman step by step. So looking at things like, do you have family in the area that you would like to live near? Do you have a job that you need to be close to? Are there caregivers or support for your children that you need to be near to so that they can access those people? And then starting with that, looking at the other things. How much are we going to be able to afford for housing, if anything? Most of our women, when they're coming out of the jail system, do not necessarily have a job that's ready to go where they're going to have immediate access to funds. So looking for those other programs such as the HPRP, which is Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing, Shelter Plus Care, other specialized transitional housing providers in the area, and working through what would be the best fit. It's very important that each plan is individualized. No housing can be a one-size-fits-all. Each family is different, and each woman has unique needs. Once we get that initial plan together, the staff actually works with the woman in coordination with the correctional staff to make sure that she feels comfortable with the housing and that the staff feel comfortable with the housing. So we visit potential sites to make sure that they're safe and that they're a good fit. When appropriate, we also assist in transportation so that client can go out and see the apartment or the housing before they get there. And we make sure that all of the paperwork and eligibility requirements are met, and that if the client needs a helping hand, if they need an advocate, that we take that role for the client. Again, they're not going to necessarily be used to speaking up for themselves or knowing how to effectively do that, and so we help role model that for them so that they can see that their needs do count and that they can have input into place for housing. Because it's so difficult for our women to access housing, Volunteers of America has developed in-house programs to make sure that we have flexibility to place our women in safe and appropriate housing. So we are a grantee for homeless prevention and rapid rehousing funds. This is a 3-year program that initially started through federal stimulus funds, and it will soon be rolling over into just a regular HUD program through the Continuum of Care application process that's done every year. We received $1 million over 3 years to be able to do up to 18 months of rental assistance and case management services for our women. When we initially started out, we thought that we might be doing 6-7 months of rental assistance and then to take over after that. And what we found is that many of the families really need that 12 to 18 month time period. It gives them a breather, so that they can get back on their feet. It allows them flexibility to go out and job training classes, to maybe take some continuing education courses, and to find employment, with the goal being that once the 18 months of assistance is up, they can stay in that same apartment. We don't want them to have to move because either A, it wasn't an appropriate fit with where they needed to be geographically, or B, they can't afford the apartment. So the case managers work very hard at the forefront to make sure that once the assistance ends, the apartment is appropriate for that woman. We also have Shelter Plus Care apartments, and we have 26 units of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments. This is considered permanent housing through HUD, and these are really for our women that they have multiple barriers to self-sufficiency. They have chronic substance abuse issues. They have a serious mental illness. Maybe they have a physical disability, something that is going to make it less likely that they are going to be able to get back on their feet in the 18-month time period. So they have a documented disability. These clients must have been homeless prior to incarceration, and it's really more for our county folks, people that are coming through the county correctional system versus the state jail system. But what we're able to do with this program is give women that would not have otherwise had a chance to have their own place to live a very safe and nice home. And so we've had women that have lived there 5-6 years. We've had other ones that maybe after 2 or 3 years, they're able to slowly transition out and paying the full amount of rent. It's a graduated rental system, so when they first come in, if they have no income, that's fine. Once they are able to have some sort of income coming in, then they start paying 30% towards rent. Because it's a sponsor-based program, our apartment complex has been, I think, more flexible in working with us than if it had been a different type of Shelter Plus Care. And what sponsor-based means is that VOA is actually in direct partnership through the leasing agreement with the landlord. It takes a little bit of risk off of the landlord. I'm going to turn it over briefly to Mary Bushner so that she can talk about the history of developing the relationships with the landlords and some of those key points.
Hi. Volunteers of America met with the apartment property managers to discuss leasing the 26 units to our Shelter Plus Care clients. this apartment management that we chose was already working with federal tax credits and Section 8 for some of their apartments. However, they were somewhat reluctant to work with us initially, as many of our clients have criminal histories. We discussed Volunteers of America's eligibility requirements for a woman to even come into the Shelter Plus Care program, which includes mandatory participation in outpatient program, followed by weekly aftercare. The women have to obtain employment, and they have to actively participate in the 12-step program. Also, we have a case manager that does monthly housekeeping inspections and random urine drug screens. And once we assured the property managers that we closely monitor this problem, then Volunteers of America and headed apartment managers agreed it was a win-win situation. We meet regularly with the apartment management staff. If any problems arise that cannot be resolved with the apartment management staff, then Volunteers of America will meet with headed property managers to discuss resolution. But ongoing communication has contributed, I think, to the success of this partnership. And in fact, the property managers were also very willing to increase the number of apartments for our HPRP program. And I'll pass it back to Nadine.
Thanks, Mary. Really what we found, and what I think that the research bears out, is that it does no good to just provide housing for someone that is coming out of incarceration. You need to be able to provide linkages to income so that they can continue to support that housing. And so Volunteers of America applied for and became a United Way of Greater Houston Thrive partner, which is a collaboration of organizations to support family economic stability. But through that, we are able to have a dedicated employment support specialist, which links to job training programs, both in-house and through the community, and also job placement. So we have several programs, such as an optometric tech training program and commercial driver's licenses programs, where the job fields are a little bit more flexible for people with criminal backgrounds, and we're helping our women to go through that process. Our employment support specialist comes out of the correctional field, so she's very experienced dealing with this population, and so she does coaching with them on, in the interview process, how do you talk about any past criminal background history, how do you spin it into a positive light, what things should you say, what things shouldn't you say, and really helps provide that navigation so that they can get employment and then sustain that employment once they have it. Tying it all together, just go through one of our clients to show you how these services work together. Linda entered the HUA program, and she began receiving the substance abuse treatment and support services there. And then after she had completed about 8 months of her sentence, she was paired with a mentor and gained that community support to help sustain her through the transition phase once she was released. Upon release, she entered one of our apartments through the HPRP assistance and continued on into outpatient treatment and continued with her mentoring services. She then entered the VOA optometric tech training program and is now being trained for an optometric tech position so that she can go out and work in a doctor's office or a lens crafter's or an eye master's. So that is it for us, and be happy to answer any questions now or at the end.
Thank you, Nadine and Mary. I think we're going to save the Q&A and do all of the question and answers at the end. Our final presenter is Stephen Norman with the King County Housing Authority. So I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Shaun. My job today is to walk you through the perspective from the vantage point of a landlord, particularly a public landlord, in terms of how these programs can work effectively with the rental market. And let me see if I can get this to move. There we go. Okay, so why are housing authorities important? Well, they're important because they control federal subsidies for about 3.1 million households. This seems like a lot, but it's not a panacea. Subsidized housing is not an entitlement for low-income households, and the public housing and Section 8 programs actually serve only a quarter of the eligible households nationally. It's important to remember that the vast majority of low-income households live in unsubsidized private sector housing, in many cases sharing units, putting up with substandard conditions, and being significantly rent-burdened. Housing authorities, however, are increasingly involved with special needs and hard-to-house populations. They are increasingly looking at how to serve at-risk populations that are already in their housing. This has led to a more sophisticated conversation with service systems, mental health, substance abuse, the Veterans Administration, child welfare, about the need and availability of support services. In many ways, the current dialogue about reentry populations is where the conversation was about 15 years ago between affordable housing managers and the mental health community. My intent today is to encourage this dialogue and to provide perspective and insight from the housing authority's point of view as to how to make this dialogue a productive one. So let's look at the issue of supply constraints, particularly from the perspective of one housing authority. The King County Housing Authority serves the metropolitan Seattle region outside the city of Seattle. It's a suburban region of about 1.2 million people, including the majority of the region's poor households. KCHA administers about 13,000 federally subsidized units, 3,000 in public housing and 10,000 through the Section 8 program. Each of these programs has a waiting list of roughly 10,000 households, and the wait to get to the front of the line can take years. In the case of the Section 8 program, the waiting list has been closed for over 3 years. Roughly a quarter of KCHA's vouchers are from new federal voucher pots over the last 15 years that have been earmarked for specific populations. These populations include disabled individuals, funded through the mainstream program, homeless veterans through VASH, homeless families with children in out-of-home placement, and homeless youth aging out of the foster care system are being funded through the Family Unification Program, or FUP, and victims of domestic violence. And each of these programs came with new Section 8, what we call incremental vouchers. This concept of incremental vouchers is important. I'm going to return to it later. These incremental vouchers are increasingly being coordinated with services. Currently, the VASH program provides funding simultaneously to HUD for housing subsidies and to the VA for case management. The local VA medical center and the local housing authority then administer the program jointly on the ground. A new allocation of vouchers for chronically homeless mentally ill individuals proposed in the HUD 2010 budget is also being linked directly to mental health funding being provided through SAMHSA. So in addition to supply constraints, let's talk about perceived risks. Community perception is an important one. There's an existing tendency in many communities to associate public housing and Section 8 with criminal activity. Perception has eroded the political support for public housing and complicated our efforts to expand supply and cite new housing. We hear an argument over and over in the national media supported by studies such as the one released by the University of Memphis Center for Community Criminology Research and popularized 2 years ago in an Atlantic monthly article that Section 8 household distribution patterns match crime patterns in metropolitan areas. We believe the reasoning to be flawed for a number of reasons, but it is illustrative of the delicate line we walk with this program. Now, why is it so delicate? Because the Section 8 program is totally dependent on the acceptance of these housing vouchers by private landlords. Another concern on the part of housing authorities is the lack of adequate services that have accompanied past efforts to use public housing to serve special needs populations. Services have either not been available, have cut off shortly after households were housed on the theory that they were now stabilized and no longer needed services, or have disappeared with the first budget downsizing. This has left public housing authorities literally holding the bag, with housing authority staff becoming first responders on mental health, domestic violence, and substance abuse issues. This concern has been compounded by the steady loss of public housing funding for services and tools for enforcement. Housing authorities no longer receive drug elimination grants that traditionally funded community policing, anti-gang, and drug elimination issues. Legislation currently in front of Congress would prohibit housing authorities from banning or even registering guns in public housing. I hear a lot of questions about what exactly the federal and public housing rules are in terms of who gets admitted to assisted housing. The following is the current state of affairs. The federal government absolutely prohibits in either public housing or Section 8 program lifetime sex offenders or individuals convicted of running meth labs in federally assisted housing. I think it's also fair to say that there's pressure from the federal government on housing authorities to proactively identify and either screen out or evict individuals who are involved with drugs, deemed habitual criminals, or increasingly now are undocumented. HUD regulations require housing authorities to establish procedures to screen out or evict illegal drug and alcohol abusers and other households who, by virtue of a pattern of criminal behavior, threaten the safety and security of assisted housing communities. These regulations, promulgated in 1996 as the one-strike rules, extend accountability to all family members and guests and for actions that take place both on and off the assisted premises. While mitigating circumstances can be considered, housing authorities' security efforts are evaluated and scored annually as part of each housing authority's FAS scoring from HUD. The new Section 8 Voucher Reform Act, SEVER, currently under consideration by Congress, would strengthen the one-strike provision by applying it more solidly for Section 8 recipients. Beyond these federal rules, however, admission or eviction criteria are a matter of local housing authority discretion. KCHA has worked to minimize additional restrictions and takes very seriously the concept of extenuating circumstances. Our properties, however, tend to be low-crime communities with minimal gang and drug activities, which we believe to be essential for successful reentry. This is not the case, however, in many inner-city communities. I want to go back to the concept of private landlord acceptance because this is absolutely key. Section 8 voucher holders, except in instances where local jurisdictions or states have passed fair housing laws, are not a protected class, and the ability to have a functioning Section 8 program is dependent upon landlords' willingness to take vouchers. Landlords can simply refuse, and a considerable number do, to take voucher households. One statistic that housing authorities monitor closely is what we call the shopping success rate. How many households issued a voucher are actually successful in getting the landlord to accept them. At KCHA, approximately 10% of voucher holders fail to find housing. This is considered an exceptionally low rate in many locales. Even where landlords are willing to make exceptions in response to specific mitigating circumstances, they have to be careful. Failure to apply exception policies uniformly and consistently leave landlords vulnerable to fair housing complaints from the next household they reject. And landlords have potential civil liabilities arising from renting units to applicants with criminal records. In Washington State, the legislature passed a law trying to fix this by providing landlords with immunity from these claims. The law required, however, that they notify all prospective tenants of their policy to waive criminal screening criteria. This was a complete no-starter with the local landlord community, and the law was promptly repealed. It's also important to recognize that the trend around the country is to consolidate much of the multifamily property management business into large corporate firms. These present both a problem and an opportunity. The problem is these firms tend to be rigid and have risk-averse standard screening policies. The upside is that if you are able to develop a working relationship with one of these firms, they control access to a significant number of units. Enough with the constraints. Let's talk about how we can actually move forward and increase the number of returnees who are being housed. In order to provide meaningful levels of access to either the Section 8 or public housing programs, new dedicated resources will be needed. As there's virtually no new public housing being developed, this leaves Section 8. Funds could come either from HUD or from other involved systems, the Justice Department, local correctional and criminal justice systems, or other local players. Most housing authorities would be happy to run mirror Section 8 programs using non-HUD funds. We need to recognize that property management is very much, as I think you've heard from the last two speakers, about risk management. Landlords, including housing authorities, need to know that if they are going to take a chance and depart from accepted screening criteria, applicants have been vetted, that someone has taken responsibilities for the client's success and for ensuring that necessary support services are available, that there is someone they can call on if there is a problem, and that all of this will not go away with the next budget cycle. A third important tool, in addition to additional resources and available services, is flexibility. The King County Housing Authority is fortunate in that it's one of 33 housing authorities nationally participating in what's called the Moving to Work, or MTW program. This initiative enables us to waive most HUD rules in order to craft local solutions to our local problems. Flexibility has been absolutely invaluable to HUD, to KCHA, in enabling us to design new programs, develop new partnerships, and mitigate risk. The significant number of hard-to-house and special needs households that we currently serve would not be possible without MTW. It's interesting to note that HUD has recently issued an evaluation of the MTW program and recommended that it be doubled in size. We strongly support this. We think it will get a lot more special needs and hard-to-house families off the streets and into public housing and Section 8 programs. In addition, we would urge HUD to aggressively provide regulatory waivers to housing authorities proposing to implement programs where there's already been proof of concept by an MTW agency that the proposed rule that's being waived, that waiver has actually worked and been effective. Using our MTW flexibility, we've developed a number of approaches out here in the Seattle area that I think are worth talking about. I'm going to quickly focus in on our screening policies and then on three specific projects that are underway that have either households with criminal backgrounds who are cycling through the jail system on a regular basis, or in the third case, with women being released from the State Department of Corrections and potentially reunited with children in at-home placement, very similar in concept to the VOA model that we've already heard. First, on screening policies. Compliance with federal regs. KCHA reviews applicant histories for sex offenses, meth lab operation, Class A felonies, and patterns of criminal behavior. The first two issues, the bar is federal and cannot be waived. On Class A felonies and on patterns of criminal activity, we look very hard at mitigating circumstances and indications that individuals are at a lower risk than the history would suggest. Again, this is about risk management, our obligation to the residential communities we're moving folks into, and compliance with federal regs. We look for completion or participation in supervised programs, a service plan, absence from the household of the individual known to have caused the problem, a steady job. These are the kind of mitigants that we can take into account in terms of waiving the entrance bar. We apply the same standards to individuals with criminal records who are reuniting with households already in our assisted housing. And there we find with particular concern are individuals with gang or drug affiliations who are returning to venues where they have previously gotten into trouble. This is a much smaller problem for us out here in our complexes because they tend to be small and not located in high-poverty neighborhoods. But it is a major problem in other parts of the country. One strategy that we use is to transfer the entire family to a public housing complex in an entirely different neighborhood. Households moving into supportive housing, such as the ones I'm going to talk about in a minute, are not screened by the authority beyond the minimum federal requirements. So what have we seen as results here? We have roughly a 2% rejection rate for applicants with criminal histories in our public housing and Section 8 programs. Our shopping success rate for households receiving Section 8 vouchers, and we issue about 900 a year, is around 90%. This is a function of both market conditions, program payment standards, how much the rent the housing authority is willing to subsidize, our willingness to extend the housing search period as necessary, and very importantly, as you've heard previously, housing search and landlord liaison assistance that works on an ongoing basis with the landlord community. In the case of our special needs and hard-to-house populations, it is critical that the ongoing services be closely tied to the client and that the support be both accessible and transparent to the landlord. Our subsequent termination rate for criminal activity in terms of both our public housing and Section 8 programs is extremely low. Less than 3% of our terminations in a year are for criminal activity reasons. So we find that having a nuanced approach to admission where we really look at individual case histories has worked very well in terms of increasing the number of folks who we do not reject, but at the same time assuring that we do not have criminal problems arising in the community from lowered admission bars. So let me talk about a couple of the programs that we run for special needs populations. The Forensic Assertive Community Treatment Program, or FACT, is an example of one of the programs we've been able to develop using MTW flexibility. It's similar in concept to the sponsor-based Shelter Plus Care program described by the VOA. It targets chronically homeless mentally ill individuals who are churning between the streets, the jail system, the hospital emergency rooms, and the shelters. And as with the rest of the country, jails in King County have become the default mental health facilities for these individuals. KCHA partners with the county mental health system and frontline service providers to develop permanent supportive housing for this population in several ways. In some cases, it's a site-based supportive housing model, and in other cases, such as this one, individuals who are thought to be capable of living in scatter site housing with robust wraparound services are moved into a sponsor-based model. Because this is a population that cannot go out with a Section 8 voucher and successfully engage a landlord, we provide the Section 8 funding directly to the participating mental health agency. They directly lease apartments, guaranteeing the rent, responsibility for lease compliance, and committing to repairs for apartment damages. They, in turn, sublease to their clients who essentially are in there reporting in a landlord capacity to the mental health provider. Services are provided through ACT teams, which visit clients regularly and are available 24/7. There's a problem, the provider is directly responsible for evicting or relocating the tenant. Again, we see risk mitigation for the landlord as being a key tool in securing housing. A crucial element in the success of this program, and I think this is a theme we've heard throughout today, is the addition of housing specialists who actively work with the landlords to the ACT teams. And this is absolutely crucial. Many of your teams are very skilled in case management issues, but do not know how to talk to a landlord. And bringing this expertise under the tent, so to speak, for the supportive housing teams is going to be critical in actually getting the landlords to the table. We've currently got over 100 units leased for targeted populations under this program. Another approach we use is to create front-end transitional housing programs to work with households before they move into public housing. We support over 200 units of transitional housing that serve as a gateway into our public housing units. Currently, we work with the YWCA to build Passage Point, which is a 46-unit transitional facility for individuals, primarily women, who are being released from the state correctional system and have children in out-of-home placement. And again, this is very similar to the population that the VOA is targeting, and engagement with the population, as I think you've heard on both presentations, starts before release out of the correctional system. The facility will provide an 18 to 24-month program that focuses on life skills, employment, and parenting skills. It operates in close coordination with the Child Welfare Department at the state level with the intent of successfully reuniting mothers with their children. The Housing Authority project-based Section 8 in the transitional housing to cover the operating costs of the housing. Service costs are covered through a combination of county and philanthropic funds. As a supportive housing facility, KCHA waives all screening beyond that required by federal law. Families that successfully complete the program are provided with priority access into our public housing system without additional screening. I think this is also an interesting model in that it starts to map out how a relationship between transitional reentry programs and public housing authorities can be structured, how you do the handoff from the transitional programs into permanent housing with a level of subsidies that handles the problem of temporary subsidies that go away before families are economically equipped to actually secure housing on the private market. Finally, I want to talk about Pacific Court. This is permanent supportive housing that we've developed actually as part of the public housing system. Similar to the sponsor-based scatter site FACT model that we talked about earlier, this housing targets a chronically homeless, mentally ill population, the bulk of whom have been churning through the local jail system on a regular basis. Site-based housing offers a number of advantages over scatter site housing in that it provides what we call the front desk function. It provides strong peer group support if it's a well-run supportive housing complex, and there are economies of scale of being able to deliver support services in a single location. Here, the Housing Authority was able to purchase a 32-unit failed condominium conversion project. The project was delivered fully rehabbed and vacant. KCHA turned on banked public housing subsidies to provide the necessary rental. The complex is operated by the Housing Authority as part of the public housing portfolio. As public housing cannot support debt, the key to this program was to acquire the property debt-free. We moved quickly to secure it using a line of credit, and then the county and the state subsequently split the cost of the purchase, so there is no debt service on the property. The Housing Authority and the county jointly selected an on-site mental health provider who's funded through a mix of county mental health and Medicaid funding. Again, no screening beyond federal requirements, and in this case, arson history is performed by the Housing Authority. Complex houses 50 individuals in 32 one- and two-bedroom units, and it's been an interesting journey. During the rent-up stage, we needed to hire on-site security to the evening hours and to meet monthly with the local police department. The site is now so quiet that the police have discontinued the monthly meetings, and nobody in the community is aware that this is actually supportive housing. Final thoughts. Talk to your public housing authorities. Many are now engaged in supportive housing and in the issues of hard-to-house populations, and some have significantly increased flexibility in shaping these programs to meet local priorities under the Moving to Work program. Second is that opportunities do present themselves. The Pacific Court model is a good example. Because KCHA had existing partnerships with the county and the mental health system, we were able to move quickly to take advantage of a market opportunity. In the case of the FACT program, the county received additional funding from the state and was able to approach the Housing Authority about matching service dollars with housing subsidies. Third is bring resources. In order to be taken seriously by housing authorities and landlords, the prisoner reentry effort must bring resources to the table. Reliable and effective supportive services are a prerequisite. Housing subsidies through either new Section 8 vouchers or local funding are also critical. This initiative cannot go to scale by increasing its market share of existing federal subsidy programs. There are simply not enough available units. Finally, appreciate landlord risk issues. To successfully negotiate housing access, you need to put yourselves in the shoes of the landlord. Understand their concerns and structure your programs to respond to those concerns. Simply beating down the door isn't going to work. We need to design programs that at the end of the day, landlords will feel comfortable working with. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A portion of the webcast.
Thank you, Stephen. There are a couple of more slides that will display during the question and answer session. The first includes links to the organizations that each of our speakers are affiliated with. If you're interested in learning more about anything that you heard today, I'd encourage you to visit these websites. The final slide that I'll put up in the next few minutes will include the contact information for each of the presenters. We will now begin with the question and answer session. And to ask a question, please just type the question into the Q&A panel, which is on the bottom right hand of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many of these questions as possible. The first question for the panelists that came in, we have one attendee that wants to know, how can we best go about partnering with city, county, and or state officials to develop support and funding for reentry housing?
This is Andy. I'll take a quick crack at it. I'm assuming we're all on here now.
Yep, you're all on.
Okay. So this is Andy McMahon with CSH. I think I would, in terms of trying to attract support from public officials, elected or appointed or otherwise, I guess from my perspective, I would think about two key messages or issues. One is the frame or message of public safety and the fact that as we are able to stably house people into the community, the likelihood for recidivism reduces, and so therefore to some extent, although there's certainly plenty of technical violations, there is an enhancement of public safety. So I think in talking about public officials, I think it's really important to try to frame some of our efforts and our interest in resources through the frame of public safety. The second I would mention is cost effectiveness and reduction in utilization of crisis services like the jails or prisons. I think this is particularly true in places where you have overcrowding in jails or prisons, or where you have and then you have people who are then being sent to other states in many places. And so where we can demonstrate reductions in recidivism as reductions or avoidance of cost to public systems, I think are at least the two most compelling arguments or frames we've been using.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Do any of the other panelists have anything else that they'd like to add to that?
I think another thing that's helpful is to look for collaborations that are going on in your area. So, for instance, if you have a coalition for the homeless, like we do in the Houston-Harris County area, or a group of faith-based providers that's already looking at reentry services, try to find another group, because there is power in numbers, and start networking with some of the other people that have the same vested interests as you, and work together to develop a plan for how you communicate that message to public officials.
Okay, great. Another question. This is from Heidi. She wants to know, to any of the agencies, how do your leases work? Is the client on the lease? Is it the client and the agency? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Mary, we can't hear you. Can you speak up, please?
Okay. For us, it is the client leases from the landlord. The leases in the client's name.
We still can't hear you, Mary. Are you on a speakerphone? If you are,
okay.
Pick it up.
We might be having a little bit of technical difficulty, but for us with VOA, yes, we do have the client listed on the lease, and we also have it as a line item in the lease that if the client does not follow through with their program stipulations from VOA, that could be grounds for lease termination, and it lets everybody know on the front end that there's certain programmatic requirements that the clients are supposed to participate in, and it helps the landlord again have that level of comfort of, okay, someone is monitoring this client.
Right.
And we cut it both ways. In the public housing and Section 8 programs, the lease is directly with the client. In our sponsor-based program, where we're using Section 8 funds to fund the mental health providers, they enter into the leases with the landlords, and the actual client is a subtenant and has a sublease with the provider, but does not have a direct relationship with the landlord. And this, again, goes to reducing the risk to the landlord. Regardless of what goes on the sublease level, the service provider is on the hook to the landlord for the rent and for the condition of the apartment.
All right.
And this is Andy. I'll be quick. We do both as well. I think in a lot of our scattered site and then kind of master leasing arrangements, it's a sublease through a nonprofit partner, but there's certainly lots of instances with supportive housing developments and some other arrangements where it's a direct tenant-landlord relationship with the client or tenant, as it were.
All right. Great. Question. Somebody wants to know, have any of the panelists been involved in efforts to get your state legislature to amend or enact laws to reduce landlord liability or reduce discrimination? If so, do you have strategies and languages that you could share?
Well, the experience in Washington State is that the legislature actually did pass a law limiting civil liability for landlords who were waiving their criminal screening criteria. But as part of the law, they required that those landlords notify any prospective tenants that they were indeed doing this. And the landlord community roundly walked away from the law and it wound up getting repealed. They simply did not want to be in a position where they were telling every applicant for housing, oh, by the way, we routinely waive criminal background checks.
All right. Anybody else have anything to add to that one? Okay. If not, I have a question. This might be good for Andy. Are there any statistics validating immediate access to the housing versus forcing them to come through the back door, hitting the shelters to qualify as homeless before gaining access? In our community, that is the only way to access housing vouchers.
There's a lot involved in that question. I can take a crack at it.
Okay.
I'm assuming this relates to the definition of homelessness that I should say has been amended a little bit by HUD. It used to be that if you had been in a public institution no less than 30 days, you would still be eligible or considered quote-unquote homeless upon release. That number is now 90, which doesn't solve all of the problem, but having done some data analysis on this, there is certainly a significant cohort of people who turn in and out of jail in that 30 to 90-day period. So I want to note that there is some increase of availability there. The other thing I would say is that in our experience, I think part of it too then, I think a strategy that I would mention is also trying to figure out kind of non-shelter but interim housing solutions, even if they may be for 2 days or a week or something like that, but where people maybe it's people are in a SRO type week-to-week type thing that a nonprofit might use. So creating a kind of a way station, if you will, is one approach to that. I think we have done some analysis of this issue, and I think I've seen that dynamic. And I think what I can say in terms of the research, although much of it is still emerging, is that there certainly is, I think, emerging evidence that we are better able to end that cycle and reduce recidivism and homelessness if we're able to do that at the outset when people exit and not once they begin to return through the system, if you will, because it's been an interesting phenomenon, I know, in our experience, that in some cases these are kind of people, quote-unquote, everybody knows, yet they're not always easy to find on a day-to-day basis. And so some of the outreach and engagement gets trickier as they dump back into the emergency system.
All right, great. How can transitional housing programs provide employment services to help people get the income to pay rent after the short-term housing assistance ends?
For us, with Volunteers of America, we partnered with the local United Way. Especially with the economic climate being the way that it is, there's a lot of interest and I think a lot of funding support available to assist people with employment. So for us, that happened to be the United Way. We also work very closely with the local workforce. So if you in your state have a division that does workforce development or workforce assistance, normally this would be the same agency that does the unemployment assistance. I would suggest talking with them because many times they have resources available for your clients. In Texas, we have a specialized thing that's called Project Rio, and it's specifically designed to help people that are in reentry. So they're looking at people that have backgrounds and helping them with employment.
Okay, great. I have a question from Carrie who wants to know how specifically did they approach public housing to manage properties? How should we? Can you provide some assistance on this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. How specifically did they, meaning the presenters, approach public housing to manage properties?
Well, I know from the public housing perspective, we've had the mental health system come to us and say, we have folks who are turning between the streets and the jails and the shelters who we'd like to house. We have a very robust service package that we can put with them. Can you marry vouchers to our mental health providers to provide stable housing for them? So it was a pretty explicit approach. A lot of this was in the context of the 10-year plan. Increasingly, communities around the country have a planning framework in their local communities around 10-year plan and homelessness efforts, and that becomes an important forum for human service systems and housing providers to talk to each other and to develop these kind of partnerships.
Okay, thanks. I got a question from Natalie. She wants to know how can we stress the importance and benefits of providing supportive housing to regular housing owners and landlords in our community? Do you have any suggestions?
The benefits to the community?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, at least in our experience, again, I think depending on, I mean, obviously, you're not apt to please the entire community or all stakeholders. That said, I think there is, I guess I would go back a bit to the points I made earlier around enhancing public safety and reducing utilization of crisis systems. I mean, those might seem a little maybe not that poignant to some people, but I do think that particularly the public safety frame and I think that the reality is that if these folks are not living in the supportive housing concept, if these people aren't living in housing stably and aren't getting the various supports they need, they're going to be on our streets and in our shelters and committing public nuisance crimes, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I think too, just to emphasize that they make better tenants because if you're getting the support services that you need, you're much more likely to keep the apartment better, to make sure that you're paying any rent down on time, and that safety-wise that you're following all the rules.
We've got a question here that is for Stephen. Renee wants to know if the Passage Points Transitional Housing Project is subsidized through tenant-based vouchers or is it a project-based voucher?
We're doing two things in the way of subsidies for Passage Point. We are taking some of our tenant-based vouchers and project-basing them into the actual transitional units. So there's a Section 8 subsidy that essentially pays the operating costs of the transitional housing. The service costs are covered outside of the program. And then when folks graduate, we're providing them with priority access into public housing. So a public housing subsidy will come into play to provide permanent housing for as long as the household needs it.
Okay, great. I have a comment here and then a question. Bob says that Andy mentioned that helping housing providers understand the importance of public safety and that there are resources available to support landlords. He also wants to know, are any of the panelists working in collaboration with a probation or parole agency?
I'll mention very quickly, absolutely we are, and I'm glad that question came up because I realized I have not touched upon that. We have developed pretty close working relationships with a number of parole and probation departments. I guess a couple of quick points that I would mention. One is that while it may not be true in every case, it's been our experience that you actually can get probation and parole to work collaboratively and in partnership with you. And actually we have seen, in some cases, we have included them as part of ACT or Service Community Treatment Teams, and so they have become part of the kind of interdisciplinary team that is working with some of the people that we're working with. So I actually think with the right folks, it can be a significant benefit. And to that point around kind of the quote-unquote right folks, what we have done is work closely with parole and probation, and I'll just mention one example. Here in Hennepin County in Minneapolis, we have basically worked with the county board and the community corrections department, and we now have a dedicated PO for our Fuse initiative, or the folks cycling between incarceration and homelessness. So I think the answer is yes, and I think it's really important to find a probation or parole officer or two or three, or depending on the scale of what you're looking at, that you can really build relationships with. I think that's really critical in terms of the kind of communication and coordination and the logistics and the efficiency of working with folks is to get working with parole and probation in those departments to get dedicated staff who are targeted and probably have a better understanding of your population.
Great.
I'd just echo that and say that we found that the Harris County Community Supervision's Star Drug Court for the area, they're very willing to work with providers, and we've actually had our staff go in and do some cross-training. So we've come in and talked to them about the importance of substance abuse treatment and about some of the issues that our women see, and therefore, something that their POs are going to see. And I think that it works really well when you keep that communication going and you approach it as a partnership.
Great. This question is from Arthur. And he wants to know about tracking clients that come through your system. What exactly do you track, and how do you do it?
We use the HMIS system, the Homeless Management Information System, and then we also have another web-based data system that does more of the clinical work. But we track things such as are they discharging a permanent housing? At various follow-up points, are they still in housing, and are they still sober? We look at a self-sufficiency index. There's a great tool that's called the self-sufficiency matrix, and it looks at multiple different areas of a client's life, and you can rate them from anywhere from crisis all the way up to self-sufficiency, and so it gives you a nice snapshot as the client moves through your services and beyond to see where they're at.
Okay.
I would just mention very quickly that we track in different initiatives, I think some different factors. I think two central ones are kind of housing stability and recidivism.
Great. Okay. Are any of you aware of any programs that have state-to-state collaboration? I take it that's a no?
Meaning within a single state or across states?
Across states is how I read it, Andy.
Not us.
Not you. Okay. Looks like we're getting close to 3:30. Do a couple more questions. Where or how should I start to look for partnerships with housing programs if my agency does not provide housing?
I think I go back to the 10-year plan forum. If there is a 10-year plan group operating in your region, that would be a good first stop.
I think that's the best first stop, and I think the second stop is your local continuum of care and then your public housing authority folks.
Great. All right, one final question, and it's about NIMBY. How do you get around the NIMBY, not in my backyard concept when creating housing opportunities for ex-offenders?
Lots of communication and education, talking to the neighborhood associations, having them come out and see your facilities You know, if you've got something that's going to look nice and blend into the community and they can come out and see that your clients are going to blend into the community, it gives them a level of comfort.
Great. Anybody else? All right. If not, this concludes the Reentry Housing Strategies webinar. Once again, I would like to thank our presenters, Mary Buchner and Nadine Scamp from Volunteers of America, Texas, Andy McMahon with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and Stephen Norman from the King County Housing Authority. Also, a special thank you to Carol Wilkins for helping put this webinar together and for chairing the National Reentry Resource Center Housing Committee. This webinar was made possible with funding support from the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. There will be a short survey after you exit the webinar, and we would really like you to take that. It helps us do what we do better. Thank you for attending our webinar.
Thank you.